Sorry, on tomorrow.
Okay, let us go ahead and get started. We hope you had a wonderful spring break, and we now turn to, oh, yes. Oh, yes, first the assignment.
We'll make some remarks about the assignment next week. You should have all received it. And there's just one thing I wanted to anticipate about remarks. We don't want you to ask us whether a certain approach is a good approach, whether this or that is a good way of addressing the assignment, because that defeats the purpose of the assignment. If we had in mind a particular formula of what demands would like, we would not have designed the assignment. So we want to be surprised, both in content and in form. We don't want you to have our hand over you, guiding you in any particular direction. Michael.
And let me just underline that. I'm sure you've seen the assignment, which basically says write about anything in some manner, shape, or form related to something that might have appeared in the class at some moment. And we intend it to be open-ended precisely for this reason. We want you to think through this material in the most powerful ways you can. We, as Roberto said, look forward to your ideas. We look forward to being excited. We have no preconceived vision of what these writings should look like, what they should entail, what you will be arguing. If we did, as Roberto said, we would not be giving an assignment like this or frankly teaching a course like this. So we want to be excited, and therefore we want you to know this is a moment where you can really think through these ideas on your own at the most powerful levels. We know that we have done many absurd things over the semester, not least of which is running through the entire history of world philosophy on a weekly basis. If we can do that, well, whether we do it well or not is an open question, but since we think it's okay for us to at least attempt to do it, hopefully the excitement makes up for the absurdity of it. You, needless to say, can feel free to do anything that will be powerful for you in these assignments. We have no preconceived vision that we are looking for. So any questions about science?
Well, we're going to discuss it next week.
Oh, we'll also discuss
it
it much more next week.
Yeah.
Yes. Even then, I'm not sure what you would ask as a question, but you're welcome to bring questions. Sort of anything goes. But we will discuss that in more depth next week. Jumping immediately into our material, as I mentioned, this has been a rather crazy course in our willingness to jump through world philosophical traditions, and that will not slow down. So, beginning today, we jump to yet another one. To quickly recapitulate what we've been doing so far, we have, breaking somewhat the chronology of our actual week-by-week encounters, what we've been arguing is that if you look at Eurasia, there was this extraordinary revolutionary period midway through the first millennium BCE when you get these incredible philosophical and religious movements trying to rethink the entire world and rethink the human condition. We noted these became domesticated by the ensuing empires, leading to yet another massive wave of salvation religions in the first few centuries of the Common Era, which were very explicitly building upon and appropriating these elements from the mid-first millennium BCE. And we noted thereafter, surprise, surprise, many states and societies again reappropriated these materials, and we are then looking at what to do next. How these various ideas came to be appropriated and reappropriated in the early modern period, looking over those, the dangers that occurred, and what we could do now. On the Christian side, as we noted, Christianity, one of the salvationist religions, building upon the Judaic and Hellenic Axial Age movements of the first millennium BCE, developed an entire religion based upon, and we were selective in what we wanted to focus on. We focused on notions of radical love, transcendence, and creativity. As we noted, these ideas came to be often pushed aside in many of the institutionalized forms of Christianity. For well over a millennium, one of the dominant forms of Christianity in Europe was the so-called Great Chain of Being, which held that God had created an entire structure of the world, a structure of humanity in terms of classes. Everyone simply had to live out their role within that structure. Early modern race theory actually came out of that vision, where God also created different races with different endowments, and that legacy obviously is one that we are still struggling with, and many right-wing Christian movements explicitly refer back to those movements. That period, we, needless to say, do not see that as the exciting part to build out. We, on the contrary, focused on, again, these three key notions: love, transcendence, and creativity. We looked at the way love was transformed into altruism in a deadening way. We looked at the ways that a notion of humans as gods was domesticated into a sovereign property holder in early modern liberal theory. In our opinion, not terribly exciting vision. We looked at the much more exciting visions of radical self-fashioning you see in Emerson and Nietzsche. Discussed also the dangers there, and discussed what it would mean to develop a vision of self-fashioning, building again upon these notions of creativity, transcendence, and love in hopefully a more powerful way. We did the same, albeit in a shorter form, just in 2 weeks with Buddhism, looking again at the early, incredibly powerful formulations of Buddhism. Then the attempt in the 19th century by Schopenhauer, the figure we focused on, to take these ideas and secularize them and naturalize them, and we mentioned the potential dangers of the way he did so, and opened the question of how one could do it differently. And now, in our continuing radically absurd run through world history, we turn to yet another tradition that we are calling the ethics of connection. We will be arguing, you will not be surprised to hear at this point, that we will argue one of the most powerful formulations occurs in the early period, in the so-called Axial Age moment, this period midway through the first millennium BCE, particularly focusing on early Confucianism. Then we will see different ways these ideas were appropriated and domesticated in ways that we find less powerful. That active appropriation and domestication here too is very much ongoing, including in contemporary China, which is going to be pulling on elements that at least we do not feel to be the most powerful elements. And then we will ask what it would mean to rethink these ideas in the most powerful phrase, in the most powerful form for the current world. Here again, we will only be doing this in 2 weeks. Today, mainly focusing on the early Confucian tradition, and next week, primarily focusing on the rethinking of it, but we'll obviously be jumping back and forth. And as always, we hope the absurdity of the exercise will be acceptable in hopefully the power of what it will allow us to do to think through these ideas. So, to do so, let us again jump back 2,500 years, this time moving to the other end of Eurasia, looking at ideas that begin arising midway through the first millennium BCE in the North China Plain, and particularly with a figure named Confucius, who again is a rough contemporary of the Buddha, Plato, Aristotle, etc. So part of the same explosion of so-called Axial Age religious ideas. So Confucius, very much like the Buddha and very much like what is going on at roughly the same time in Greece, lived at the tail end of the Bronze Age civilizations. They were, as we've discussed, literally falling apart, the old Bronze Age states falling apart, the forms of social hierarchy falling apart, the religions that upheld those social hierarchies falling apart. Confucius was part of this radical rethinking of, therefore, how should we rethink the self, and how should we rethink the world? And to bring you into that world, let me say a few opening words about Confucius and his ideas. Now, there have been many Confuciuses. We will see some of the appropriations and domestications a little bit later in our discussion, but let me just mention that is ongoing. So even in the translations we've given you, we've chosen them because we think they're powerful translations, but the translators are trying to translate terms, ideas, even phrases in ways that will not be immediately off-putting. That's powerful, and indeed part of what we'll be doing is an active translation as well, but the danger of doing that in a translation is it means instead of seeing these ideas in their most challenging form that you then try to rethink and retranslate, the work is kind of done under the covers so you don't see it going on. So let me, on the contrary, introduce some of these ideas in their most powerful and challenging modes, which means modes that you might find extremely ludicrous. And yes, if we're going to be challenged by powerful ideas, we need to present them in a challenging way. So, from the point of view of radical nonconformity and self-fashioning, as we have noted, this comes out of the visions of transcendence and creativity of the Christian tradition, then move down to the human level, humans becoming like gods, and then what would that mean for our creativity and transcendence if we are moving it to the human level of humans becoming like gods? If this is the case, then needless to say, the focus becomes, as we have seen in detail, the radical self breaking against the structures and forms of the social world that hold that radical self back. We discuss the dangers of that formulation and how it needs to be rethought, but the opening move is that radical self. That is the heart of creativity, transcendence, and that is the mechanism by which you need to break from the structures of the world. Among those structures, of course, would be social hierarchies, of course. It would also entail many of the things we often associate with so-called traditional societies. For example, rituals, which in our view, and the view of our view meaning generally speaking a modernist view, but our view also coming from the point of view of self-fashioning, rituals would be things that socialize you into a certain mode of being in the world, which of course would be anathema to a vision of self-fashioning. It should be the self that fashions itself and not be socialized into a certain mode of being. I mention all of this to begin with a quotation from the Analects, and you're lucky you're sitting down because it's difficult to imagine a sentence that would be almost more perfectly designed to make us uncomfortable. And our translation weakens the sentence dramatically, so I'm going to give it in a very literal translation. This is from Confucius. To become humane, you must conquer the self by submitting yourself to rituals. Now, immediately you might think this can be culturally very interesting to see what Confucius was thinking, but it's difficult to imagine why we would philosophically want to take such a position seriously. I'm going to argue we should. Agree or not, that's a separate question, but I'm going to argue we should. And to do so, we will need to find out, and we will do so extremely quickly, that Confucius means by the self and by ritual very different things than we mean. The vision of humaneness, we don't really have a concept of it, but it will mean some surprising things too. And we will see it's not just the self that we would need to rethink, it is the entire workings of the social world and indeed the cosmos. So, to introduce this, let me begin with early Confucian notions of the self and of the world, and therefore what it would mean to change the world, and why, of all things, ritual would be seen as such a crucial component of that work. So, let me begin not with the self, but about the world in general, at least to our experience in early Confucianism. Is the world a structure that was given to us, and fortunately so for us, by a divine being that created the world to be one in which we could hopefully flourish that functioned for us, and indeed opened up the possibility for a future history that also would aid in our salvation? No. Or, much more importantly, who knows, but we have not only no reason to think that's the case, it would be incredibly dangerous to think that is the case. So, what is the world? The world is a mess of different energies, and those energies interact with each other constantly, and the mode of interaction creates sets of patterns in the world. So, to give an obvious example, there are certain energies that are called yin and certain energies that are called yang. So, yin, extremely cold, yang, extremely hot. Those energies interact, and at a larger level above us, when they interact over time, they form what we can call seasons. It's not that they are seasons, it's just the interaction of energies, but we will give them the name of energies, meaning when yin comes to its most powerful form, that's the height of what we will call winter, that leads to its opposite emerging, the growth of yang, that leads to growing warmth, springtime, until it reaches its height in summer, pure yang, that immediately brings out its opposite, yin begins to grow, moving into the fall, and then hitting winter. We give the name of seasons, but what it really is a pattern of interactions of things out there. I emphasize that point because that's not an inherent structure of the world. As we will see, we humans, for better or for worse, can dramatically affect those interactions, so there is no inherent structure. They are patterns of interaction. There are patterns of interaction moving down to the earthly realm too. Those patterns involve all sorts of things of, well, literally everything. Indeed, when we even describe things as being things, we are not doing something wrong, but we should know that we're using an easy temporary way of speaking to talk about what is in fact an endless set of patterns of interaction. And this holds as well for humans. So, what are you and what is the self? Is there, to give the kind of domesticated American vision of nonconformity that we've been criticizing, this vision that we all have some true self within that we should look within, find, and base our lives upon? So there's already a you in there, which is why we'll take personality tests to find out who we are, and we'll try to look within and find ourselves to find out what we should be in life and what careers would fit who we already are. In Confucianism, the answer is, again, not just no, but such a vision is incredibly dangerous. Here's what you really are, and this is going to sound bad, and it's going to get worse, but bear with me. So here's what you are. You also are a mess of different energies and emotions and faculties. All of us, by the way, are equally a bunch of messes and energies and faculties. And what we become depends entirely upon patterns of interaction, just as is true in the world at large. And, sadly, just as is true in the world at large, where these interactions are just energies that form patterns that then become sort of standardized, minus any change that is done to them, that is equally true for humans. In a, as we will see, incredibly dangerous form. So, let me give an explanation of how these patterns of interaction form, beginning with very mundane examples. You will see repeatedly, Confucian texts love to move down to just mundane reality, because the idea is that's where our patterns form that often will define our entire lives, and at a larger level, define entire social worlds. So, let's go back to you as a young child, meaning you're just a mess of energies, right? And you're lying there in your crib, and someone comes in and smiles at you, and you feel happy. In this way of thinking, that action, someone smiling at you, drags out from you, that's the Chinese term to emphasize how totally passive we are in this, drags out from you an energy of happiness. That's why you feel happy. Someone comes in and yells at you, you're angry, meaning that action drags out from you an energy of anger. So suddenly, all you feel is anger because that energy becomes overwhelming. Now, immediately you see our first problem. We tend to be totally passive in the world, and the patterns of interaction we form depend on immediate stimuli around us rather than anything else. If that sounds bad, that's peanuts, because where things get really dangerous is very soon thereafter, and this sets in at an incredibly young age, you cease even responding to actual things around you. You start responding by habit and rote pattern. So, returning to my examples, someone's walked in and smiled at you. Someone else walks in right after that person and does something unrelated, picks out socks from the drawer. For whatever reason, it reminds you of the person who previously walked in and smiled at you. And pulling socks from the drawer, therefore, also drags out from you an energy of happiness. Someone else walks in and does something equally unrelated, may also just be pulling out socks, but nonetheless, some motion reminds you emotionally of the person who previously yelled at you. It equally drags out from you an energy of anger. And the vision is, at least in the first instances, yes, we're passive, that's horrible, but at least we are actually responding to real things. Someone does smile at me, someone does yell at me. The danger from a young age is we start responding to the world by rote pattern. I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm sad, not because of any actual stimulus that ought to be leading to such a response, even in a negatively passive way. It's simply my rote patterns. And these rote patterns can become so embedded in us that they come to define how we interact with literally everyone, what we see, or more importantly, do not see in the world, and most dangerously, what we can even come to define as being us, our personality. So when we describe ourselves as, oh, I'm just the sort of person who is X, Y, and Z, from this point of view, that may be a perfectly accurate description. It has nothing to do with you. It certainly has nothing to do with a true self. It doesn't even have something to do with your personality. It is, in all likelihood, a bunch of rote patterns we've fallen into. So if you think, okay, well, I'm good at X, Y, and Z, but I've got a really bad temper in certain situations, again, that may be perfectly accurate. That's not telling about you, a true self, nothing. It's a bunch of patterns you have fallen into. Now, let me stop here for a moment. If there is anything to this idea, it's going to open up some implications for what we would do to transform the self and transform the world. So let me just pause and mention whether there might be something to this description that means we ought to continue to go forward. So, is it possible that these early Confucian ideas are onto something? I'm going to argue yes, and let me just give a couple of examples from our own time. In case you might think, okay, this is all a little silly, I really am a true self, and I do have my own personality, and of course I should live my life by who I really am. So, here's an example. So, have any of you, or I should say, do any of you have friends? I'm sure none of you would fall into this, but do any of you have friends who you have noticed have the identical relationship, usually bad, with anyone they date? And in fact, you even get to know as a friend it playing out every single time. They go out on a date, everything is great, they go on a second date, things are going well, but suddenly they're beginning to say, yeah, but I'm a little worried. And you're like, remember that happened the last week. 17 people you dated, this is a totally different person, totally nice, just like don't fall into the pattern again. It doesn't matter, they fall into the pattern every single time. It ends up being a total disaster, the relationship falls apart, and then what do? They meet someone else. else, and it happens all over again. Meaning, it has nothing to do with who they are dating. They're not relating to that person at all. They're relating by rote pattern. Example 1. Example 2. Do you happen to know any families, and I'm sure not any here, but any families where patterns that have set in last for decades? Decades, where the same little fights play out every single day for decades on end. Oftentimes, if you watch it long enough, and as you grow older, you sadly will get to see this, it goes on for generations, where all of these bad relationships between father and parents end up getting replicated at the next level, and the next level, and the next level. So, if you've been around the world long enough to have that next generation coming up, nephews and nieces coming up, and the brothers and sisters, and you of course know the parents, have you not seen those patterns playing out not just decades, but generations? And then imagine, if you perhaps can think of examples along these lines, imagine then rethinking a lot of the things we know about social hierarchies along these lines. Have you not noticed, and here the answer sadly is clearly yes, but I'm just going to use a slightly different set of words to describe them, have you noticed how societal hierarchies can last for centuries? Centuries. Even in, and I'll give an obvious example, we're in America, maybe certainly people in this room would like to say we're good liberals, we don't believe in any discrimination, and yet statistically it is clear there is almost no social mobility in America. Racial discrimination has barely shifted. Many professions still have incredible levels of gender discrimination, and this has been for decades of self-proclaimed liberals who, I'm sure, honestly, truly believe they have no discrimination. And yet it just replicates over and over. It replicates because of, using this way of thinking, basic patterns that play out in the ways job interviews are run, what you're looking for when you read an application, and you just replay these patterns for decades and indeed centuries. So, what if this is what humans are like? We are the equivalent of seasonal change, which I'll get back to later. That may or may not be something we want to change. We're changing it whether we want to or not. But those are just patterns of interaction. And that is what defines you as a so-called individual, which means it's not you as an individual, it's just a bunch of patterns you fall into. It will define all of your friendships and all of your relationships throughout your entire life. It will define your family relationships, and as these play out at larger societal levels, it will define entire societies, which, minus any change, can go on for decades and centuries, even when you have political ideologies that tell you, yes, we're going to create a world where everyone is being treated equally. And yet, why does nothing change? So, I suspect we can now proceed with the idea that maybe there's something to this. So, if this perhaps is onto something, the obvious question is, how in the world do we change this? Obviously, the goal of this description is to make it clear you should not be happy with you as you currently are. You may find some things about yourself fine, but once it's redescribed as a bunch of patterns you fall into, then you realize things you might call good qualities or patterns that happen to be working out well. Other things may be working out horribly in ways you don't even see, and even the so-called good sides of you, if they're patterns, might not end up being particularly good in certain situations that you by definition could not foresee. So, if we're going to redescribe you, your relationships, and indeed entire social orders as being just patterns of interaction that we have fallen into passively, and if that is not a very comfortable and happy way of thinking about yourself and the world you're living in, how do we change it? So, point number one is you ought not be happy with that, and hence, going back to our quotation, putting it in strong terms, you need to conquer the self. You don't want to love yourself. You don't want to embrace yourself as who you are. To use the American expression, I should just love myself and embrace myself as who I am. No, you do not want to love a bunch of patterns you fall into. You want to break them. You want to conquer the self. So, you conquer the self. So, maybe that opening part of Confucius' sentence is beginning to make sense. If that's what the self is, sure, we'll conquer that. That, if anything, probably makes the next part of the sentence seem even odder. So to remind you the sentence, to become humane, and coming back to humane later, you must conquer the self by submitting yourself to ritual. Now, you might think, okay, if we can follow Confucius in the idea of conquering the self, if we're going to re-describe the self this way, why in the world would we submit ourselves to ritual, which would seem, if anything, to be more of the same problem, if not even worse, because again, we want to socialize ourselves into more patterns? I mean, wouldn't the goal be to break from our patterns? In other words, wouldn't the goal be to be some reformulated vision of the nonconformity thesis, reformulated to rethink the self, but still, break out of these patterns? Well, yes, in Confucianism you want to break these patterns, but it's not in the sense of a radical disruption of everything that exists, because as you've noticed, if I decided to do that tomorrow, I probably would just be falling into patterns of who I am as a radical disruptor, and I would probably end up doing horrible things for myself and to those around me. If your goal is to build a world where we're really connected, that doesn't work. Now, fine, but you might still be wondering, well, yeah, but why would ritual work? So, just as we are showing what Confucius means by the self, let me get to early Confucian notions of ritual, which, given this redefinition of the self, as we will see, it is going to be a very different notion of ritual than the one we're used to. And to do so, let me begin with an example before I work out philosophically the vision of ritual. So here is an example that is tellingly designed by the Confucians at one institution that they then, and it turns out we know historically, were never able to get rid of. So we will get later to political theories in Confucianism and why they push as they do for the things they push for, and you will quickly see as we get into that, anything hereditary they hate, because anything hereditary just repeats patterns by definition. And so they want a governance that's based entirely on meritocracy, and they hate hereditary forms of government. The one problem they were never able to get rid of is hereditary monarchy. So we'll see where they were successful and the powers and limitations of where they were successful in building meritocratic forms of governance. They were never able to get rid of hereditary monarchy. So monarchs could be overthrown every few centuries if they were really corrupt, but otherwise you had an hereditary king. So how, if you can't get rid of that institution, how would you at least begin to break down the dangerous patterns? So, let me now tell you the ritual that they designed for a ruler, and then we'll take it apart. So, here's the ritual. So, imagine you're a king in, again, an hereditary monarchy. And this is still a very patriarchal system. So, in this example, you're male, you're the king, and you're male. And you are the king, of course, because you had a father who was the king before you, and he's dead. And also for the example, imagine you have a son who, by definition, in an hereditary monarchy, will replace you when you die. So here's the ritual. You and your son walk to the edge of a ritual space, and you stop. And then you walk in without blushing. Now, that may seem like an absurd detail. Why would you be blushing? Here's why you can't blush. Because you're not you, and your son is not you. When you walk into that ritual space, you are now the son of your son. Your son, he's not your son anymore, is now your father, which means your deceased father, his deceased grandfather. Your son, he's not your son anymore, sits on the throne as your father and your ruler. You, but you're not you anymore, you face north, because ritually speaking, the ruler faces south, and you face north looking up. He's on a throne, looking up at him, and you pay proper obeisance to him as your father and as your ruler. He is now your son, but again, he's not your son. He is now the corpse of your father. You are looking at your father, who is dead, even though you're actually looking at your son, and he looks at you, your son, looking at you as if you are his son and his subject. You then, both of you, stand up and walk to the edge of the ritual space, and then you walk out, and you're back to being you, and your son is back to being his son, your son, and all of your patterns can play out again. Why do you do this? Let's take you through that ritual and try and get a sense of what it is they're up to here. So, let's go back to you outside that ritual space. You are finally the ruler. You waited decades for this moment. I mean, your father ruled the kingdom. All the people loved your father, but you knew what he was like. He was petty, he had a bad temper, he would scream and yell at you all the time. Any good idea came out of his ministers, you knew what he was really like. You just had to stand there on that stage, decade after decade, as the people loved him, and you knew what he was really like. And now, finally, you can step into your own. You can do all of the things you were pleading with your father to implement for decades, and he couldn't do it because he was so small-minded. You can finally do it, but the people just don't like you for some reason. They loved him, and you know who they do love now who's alive? Oh, Little Junior. Oh, they love Little Junior. He's so cute. On the stage, they can't wait for Little Junior to be the king. You know what he's like. He's a lazy kid. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't even study. He's going to be a terrible king. I mean, Dad was a tyrant. He's a lazy kid. Why does no one love me? In other words, welcome to families. You are just repeating the same patterns with your father that he played out with you, and he, the Little Junior, thinks my dad's the tyrant, just as Dad thinks he's lazy, and the whole thing plays out generation after generation after generation. Welcome to families. Sadly, they're not that different now. We don't have hereditary monarchies. We claim we're not patriarchal, but things haven't really changed too much, sadly. So, if we can readily understand these family dynamics, let's go back to the ritual. How do you break this down? Do you have dad and son sit down and have all talk it out? I mean, from this point of view, the answer is no. You can do that until you're red in the face, but I mean, you're never going to talk through patterns because patterns become so embedded in our emotional interaction with those around us, and they become hardened. So they're largely unchangeable, we think. Here's how you change them. You do the ritual. And note what is going on in the ritual. It's not just that you become randomly a different person in the ritual. You become, in this ritual, the person with whom you have the most conflicted relationship, and you become the opposite person in that. The whole ritual operates through a role reversal where you being you, but you're not you in the ritual, you have to look up at your father, who is gone. You're the king now, but yet again, you're in the subordinate position, you're the subject, you're the son, and there's dad, yet again. But of course, who you're really looking at is your son. And you're being forced to realize, not cognitively, but emotionally, that you're playing out the exact same relationships with him that you had with your father. And you're being forced to once again remember what it is like to be in the subordinate position in that relationship. And Junior, your son, is also learning from an incredibly intensely young age what it means to be in a position of power, the dangers of arrogance that can come from that, the need for incredible responsibility that is easy to forget. And there's his dad just yelling at him right before the ritual, undoubtedly. But you begin to realize, yeah, I can fall into that arrogance too. And then remember, yes, you stand up, you walk out of the ritual space, and dad starts yelling at the child again. All the patterns repeat, but then you keep going back in. And then remember, this is one of an endless series of rituals you're doing constantly, where you're doing these endless role reversals with key people in your life, in your family, your relationships, constantly being forced not only to see the world from the opposite perspective, but to interact with that person in the opposite way, meaning that you emotionally sense those hardened patterns, and again, through the role reversal, which again you're doing over and over again, the patterns over time cease to be so hardened. You begin to recognize the other possibilities. You begin to recognize that, in fact, Dad, the deceased dad, and your son, they are, in fact, messy. You've fallen into this hardened pattern that seems absolutely unchangeable, and kind of is unchangeable, but you begin to sense that messiness, and you begin to open up the possibility of altering that mode of interaction. It's not a radical disruption, it's not a radical break, you're altering that mode of interaction. Now, imagine if you were not just being forced to do this, so the poor junior has no choice but to do it. You actually, as the ruler, have no choice but to do it. You're submitted to it, you have no choice. But imagine you not only being forced to do these endless role reversals, imagine if you then at a certain point begin to start undertaking self-training. They will call it in the tradition self-cultivation through these role reversals. In other words, imagine if you actively started to do this all the time, where it's not just, I fall back into my patterns, ritual reversal, back into my patterns. You actually begin training yourself. You actually begin training yourself, in other words, to begin seeing the world and seeing your interactions as an endless series of patterns. And you begin the work of endlessly trying to work on these patterns and shift these modes of interaction. In other words, you begin acting with those around you and in the larger social world in ways as if there were a ritual, but when there's no ritual telling you what to do. You are self-consciously seeing the world from different perspectives, breaking different patterns, and beginning to see what it would be like to not just understand these patterns, but more importantly, to begin to sense how you could act in the world that will begin to alter these patterns. Even, again, when there's not a ritual enforcing the role reversals, etc. What would this look like? Well, let me return to our readings of the day, because this, I would argue, is what the Analects is really about. So, as I'm sure you read, or saw, the Analects is not an easy book to read. It is literally a series of statements that Confucius supposedly said to his disciples, or a series of actions that Confucius did. It's purported to be put together by the disciples after he passed away, and it's sort of putting us in the position of the disciples, saying, the disciples are trying to figure out what it was he was doing, and it's putting us in that same position. And it is not always obvious. I mean, even a lot of the terms I've been using, I'm pulling from the tradition that emerges thereafter to explain what's going on. But note the way he's being portrayed. Because the portrait of Confucius in this text, I mean, whether it's accurate or not, we have no idea, but the portrait of Confucius in this text is of someone who has done this. In other words, someone toward the end of his life who has devoted his life to this work of self-cultivation through rituals, to the point where by the end, he's not even doing the rituals anymore. He, in a sense, has moved beyond the rituals, and he has reached the stage, and finally getting to this other key term in our sentence, of being humane. So, what does it look like were you to do all of this? Conquer the self, submitting yourself to ritual, then doing the work of training yourself thereby, and become humane. So, let me note a few terms that are used to describe him, and also the way he is described as acting, because it is very telling, to put it mildly, for the push of this tradition. So, first of all, one of the terms that pops up over and over again, very counterintuitive to our stereotypical visions of Confucius, joy. Joy. He's presented as this incredibly joyous figure, like this incredibly joyous figure that people love to be around because he shifts situations. And what I mean by that is a typical story in the Analects and elsewhere, there are a ton of these stories, is he walks into a room, he senses all the patterns playing out among all the people in the room, and he just does something to shift those patterns such that people begin interacting and really interacting, allowing the whole sort of trajectory of the situation to go in a different direction. And then when I say does something, I mean it's literally like he will walk in and he'll make a gesture. He'll straighten a mat and ask people to sit on it. He will quote a line of poetry. And the sense is, like, sticking with that last example, by quoting that line of poetry, it brings out from us a response that sort of shifts all of the patterns playing out and alters it in some way. And when it alters it, it means people begin interacting and really connecting with each other. You also have examples of him at work with his disciples, and again, it's very telling. So a standard one that will appear in endless variations is the following. He'll be walking with 3 disciples, and he'll say, okay, stop. In this situation can be something horrible, someone's passed away, it can be a difficult political situation, whatever. And he'll simply say, right now, quote me a line of poetry. And one disciple, it's always a very standard narrative, the first disciple will quote a line of poetry, and Confucius goes, no. And the second one will quote a different line of poetry, and Confucius is saying, no. Oh, actually, that one, he pauses for a little bit, and then says, no. And then the third one will quote a line of poetry, and Confucius will go, oh my gosh, yes. And when you follow the stories over and over, there are many of these, it's very clear what the pattern is. So the first disciple quotes a line of poetry that's kind of too obvious, so it does nothing to change the situation. So someone's passed away, and he'll quote a line of poetry, oh, isn't it sad, someone passed away. And Confucius like, no, you haven't changed the situation at all. The other one will quote a line of poetry, and the reason Confucius pauses is it's based upon some kind of clever play that if you really think about the line of poetry, it kind of intriguingly works with the situation in a kind of surprising way, but it's too clever. It's kind of all about the disciple showing how clever he is. It's not about changing the situation. And so the pause as Confucius thinks it through, sees what the disciple's getting at, and then kind of stronger, no, this isn't about you being clever. And the third one is always someone who will quote a line of poetry that is, yes, it's counterintuitive, it is surprising, but not to show his cleverness. It's all about a line that will bring out a response from all 4 of them in a way that will alter their interaction and way of thinking about the situation. And the yes is like, yes in the sense, yeah, I never would have thought about that line, but yes, that captures it. So in other words, the training is, you're being trained to sense situations, sense patterns playing out in situations, sense what you can do to shift those situations and shift the trajectory of the situations. And better in the sense always means better interactions, closer interactions, better ability to work together in some kind of sense to really connect with each other as opposed to connecting by rote pattern. Someone dies, when we're sad, we're angry, the standard response is, and something that alters that in some way that allows us to connect. And if that's true at the most mundane level, like right now, quote a line of poetry, the sense is Confucius is someone who does it at the societal level too, right? He trains himself in daily life to do this in immediate interactions, straightening the mat for his disciples to sit on, quoting a line of poetry, and it's the same thing. He's training himself, and therefore training his disciples, to see the social world as a series of hardened patterns and sensing what are things you can do to alter these and to shift these patterns. This is humane. Now, the disciples will ask endlessly, and I'm sure you've seen this in the Analects, literally disciple after disciple. So, can you please define this term humane, Confucius, that you keep using? And he always gives a different definition because in any situation it's going to mean something different. But I think a good way to think of it is it's a sensibility of how patterns are defining us in negative ways. You're training yourself to see how those patterns are playing out, what the trajectory would be, and you're sensing what to do to shift them. Again, what to do if there were a ritual that would give you the role reversal, but there's not going to be a role reversal in common situations. You're just sensing what are the things you should do. And humaneness is that sensibility of caring, that sensibility of how to actually shift these patterns, so to say break patterns, but again, not in a disruptive sense, that's the nonconformity vision. It's alter and shift these patterns such that you start getting real interaction. Now, I mentioned very much in passing, and intentionally so, because these ideas begin with sort of our daily life or mundane life, but I've mentioned the idea is you then do the same for the larger world. So if there's something to this vision in terms of daily life, what in the world would this mean at a larger level? Quoting a line of poetry is not going to end discriminations in social fields. So what sorts of pushes do you get in the tradition at a larger socio-political level? And intriguingly, although I would put it probably more strongly, tellingly, there's not a single ism that comes out of Confucian teachings. In other words, there's no attempt to give an ideal society, because the idea is you're always born into a world of patterns, and you're then working with those patterns. That being said, however, there are certainly pushes in the tradition that we should take seriously, because we want to take this tradition seriously. The question would be, how do we do something comparable now? And one of those key pushes, or it's a set of things, of those key pushes, is strongly emphasizing social forms that inspire and encourage education and training. So, if the world is to be described as a series of patterns, the bad part of this is the obvious part. So, what is bad would be social formations in which you have pre-given patterns that we're born into and simply stay within. So, the reason that Confucians would look back in horror at these Bronze Age societies in which everything is defined by birth means you're born into a social world, a pre-given hierarchy, which in this sense are just sets of patterns that you're told to stay within. And note again, these rituals are not socializing you into being in that world. These rituals do the opposite. Rituals in the Confucian tradition are about shifting you. You become a different person in the ritual, you see the world in a different way, you take on the alternate living, the alternate personhood of the person with whom you have the complex tensions, and what you're trying to do at the societal level is something similar. What this means in practice is the following. Confucianism, and I would say this as a larger comparative statement, more than any religious and philosophical tradition I know in all of world history, will strongly push the notion of meritocracy. And that's, even the term meritocracy is a 1950s American term that has rightly become under big question because we're slowly growing to realize that so-called meritocracy in America is not really much of a meritocracy. There's almost no social mobility in America, and America very much functions by maintaining its existing social hierarchy. So when I use the term meritocracy, I mean it in a much stronger sense. So, in the Confucian tradition, the way this will develop is the following. And there are different forms of this, but certainly one of the most powerful and significant ones is to try to do it at the state level. So, what the Confucian tradition will push toward, and eventually achieve, minus the key failure with hereditary monarchy that I mentioned, the push will be to start creating governments in which every single position, with again, this one failure of the hereditary monarch, every other single position can only be obtained through taking a civil service examination, creating, when it works, a government of an educated elite rather than an hereditary elite. So, I mentioned this period for about a millennium in Western Europe when the vision was the great chain of being, the structure of the world, including the social hierarchy, is pre-given by God, and you, as a good Christian, must just live in your position, and an active antagonism toward any kind of social mobility. If you take sort of the mid part of that, say 12th century, if that's the dominant vision in Europe, if you go across 12th century to China, with, again, the significant exception of the hereditary monarchy, you have a government in which every single other figure is in positions of power because they're educated through the civil service exam. And let me give you a sense of that civil service exam to give you a sense of how it worked. And let me preface it by saying this is not to imply they solved everything, so I'll immediately mention the limitations. only men could even take the civil service exam. So I'm not implying that the Confucian tradition worked through all of the dangerous patterns, they most certainly did not. Moreover, there was no standardized education, so you had to have a family that would somehow have the means to educate you, which even if you did come from a wealthy family, or if you came from a poor family, often they would choose. They would say, okay, of our children, we'll have this one, not work in the fields and become educated to hopefully get a bureaucratic position. So again, there were tons of limitations on this. But I also want to mention the other side of this, because it's in world history pretty striking. The way it would work is these tests were done totally anonymous. So if you wanted to take the exam, you simply go at the designated time and take the exam. You're given a number. So if you're someone from an incredibly powerful, wealthy family, the people who are reviewing your exam could not know that. So they have no way of knowing who you are. They even at one point had interviews which they blocked because they realized even with curtains and things, you could still kind of guess if it was someone really famous. And so they had no interviews. So it was simply a written exam. So totally anonymous. Anyone could take it. So there are examples of people who were born in Korea who would take go to China, take the exam, pass the exam, and work way up into the hierarchy. So no restrictions of ethnicity of any kind, and even the questions are telling. So a typical question on the exam would be something like the following. Okay, let's imagine you're a figure in charge of this local area, and here are the sets of patterns playing out. They will describe, okay, there's this incredibly powerful aristocratic family that controls X amount of land. There's a merchant family here that's made a ton of money, that's taking control of the market here. There's a huge amount of corruption from both sides, both using money to try to control the others. There's this area of fields here, in which there's a peasantry in the following way. So it just works out all of these incredibly, sadly common sets of patterns playing out. And then the question is, what are you going to do? And you are then, and I should also say, what are you going to do in the form of an argument to the ruler? And you then need to make an argument, and you're being judged not on whether there's a right answer, because there's not. I mean, how do you solve all these? There's nothing you can do to solve it. But you're being asked to solve in the ways we were just mentioning. Like, concretely, can you lay out, given the situation that's been given to you, can you see what the likely patterns are that are playing out, and what are the concrete things you can start doing? So, you build a bridge here, you shift the tax structure here, you do the following sets of reforms in the political process to create a bigger divorce between money from either the hereditary money or the merchant money to prevent them from affecting the political process. And you give these very, very concrete things, and then, if it's really successful, you will note the limitations of these. So you'll say, okay, now of course if we build a bridge here and do this and change tax rates here, it's going to have the following sets of effects, which I think will alter these patterns of interaction, but it risks the following sets of dangers, and if those begin to play out, here are further things I would recommend. And you're being tested not again on the right solution, there's not one, you're being tested on the degree to which, number one, you can see the complexity of the patterns, you can come up with concrete ways of altering these, and all of this is, number two, in the form of making an argument. So you have to write all of this in a convincing way, and that's what you're being judged on. If you pass, you are then given an incredible low level in the bureaucracy, and then you have to keep working your way up along similar lines. So with a low level, you're probably a judge in a very local area. And every single case you do, you write a case arguing, okay, here it was the case, here are the sets of patterns that were playing out, here was my judgment that I think would affect both the situation immediately as well as create precedents in the following ways. That has been read by a series of superiors. There's almost an automatic appeal process. If they disagree with you, you would have to redo the whole case. If they do agree with you, and you're seen as getting someone who's getting good at this, you get raised up, and raised up, and raised up. And to prevent you from getting too connected with local patterns of power, i.e. becoming corrupt because you get to know the local power interests, you're constantly being moved around, which was not easy because, of course, everyone's speaking different languages. China's a big empire. And so you can imagine how difficult this is. Suddenly you've been effective here, and suddenly you're in another area where you literally can't even speak the language, but that's kind of the point. You're constantly being prevented from being overly taken by immediate sets of power interests, or put it in this way of thinking, sets of patterns that would, in a sense, kind of ensnare you and end up defining your activities. So, putting this together, the push is basically towards saying, can we create a world that strongly emphasizes education and cultivation, hopefully in the form of creating as much as possible, minus the hereditary monarchy, as much as possible, an entire governmental structure consisting only of such people, which would ideally mean you get a bunch of people who are at least striving to be humane and judging each other constantly on the degree to which they're doing it. So hopefully you build in a constant learning process. And as such, you also create a sense, even for those who won't successfully take the exam, you create a sense that that is what you should be aiming for. So even if you're in a completely different walk of life, this is what you should be aiming for. And I might add, by the way, there's an entire and huge Confucian movement that will support all of what I just said, but will choose never to enter an imperial bureaucracy. So they will get the education. They often would refuse to take the exam, or would take the exam, get accepted, and then intentionally say, but I'm not going to take the position. And you would become a local teacher. And the idea was, well, that's what Confucius was. He was a local teacher. So I'm simply going to be a teacher, I will educate people, and I pass the exam, but I refuse to serve in a bureaucracy, and I'm just going to be a teacher. And part of the workings of this means you're creating a world where that, simply becoming an educated person, trying to alter the world in this very specific way, not through radical disruption of the radical individual, but through constantly seeing patterns and sensing how to alter those patterns, that becomes the vision. Hopefully, it becomes one of the pushes regardless of your role in life, regardless, in other words, of whether you actually become an imperial bureaucrat. So, what we are seeing is an incredibly powerful tradition that, yes, is all about, and this is I would make as a generalization of all the Axial Age movements, it is all about trying to alter the self and alter the world. We've seen those that emerged in West Asia. We've looked a little bit at Buddhism, right? We've seen roughly the same time. And we are now seeing a third, Confucianism, that will do it in a radically different way. It does not root the basis of the transformation in the self, but literally the opposite. It roots it all in patterns of interaction, and then the goal is to create worlds where those interactions start really becoming true interactions as opposed to simply hardened patterns. Now, to sum this up, let me just make a few final comments. So, first of all, because we're emphasizing the traditions coming out of Confucius, I've emphasized the Confucian tradition for that reason. Let me mention, China has a lot of other sides to this, and a couple of these are worth keeping in mind too. So, one early figure who will come out of this tradition, his name is Zhuangzi, Zhuangzi, has a very intriguing sort of critique but rethinking of this. So if you have noticed that the push of the Confucian tradition really is humans, and that is absolutely true. I mean, it's all about how humans can create better interactions for humans. Zhuangzi is a figure that will say, all of this makes total and perfect sense, but one of the patterns Confucius falls into that limits him is it's too human-centered. And so he will write works that kind of function as rituals of role reversals and breakings of perspectives, except not only does it not include simply fathers and sons and husbands and wives, it includes all aspects of the human life. So you become a wheelwright, you become a butcher. It also includes the natural world. You become a bird, you become a tree bark, you become a turtle. And his point is, well, if the whole world is a mess, even the distinction of humans in the natural world can be potentially dangerous. And let me simply use that to make one final point. I opened with this discussion of the entire cosmos should be thought of from this point of view as simply patterns. So let me close by returning to that. If there's anything to this way of thinking, note one of the implications. As Roberto has mentioned, one of the dominant pushes in world changing set of natural laws, and that's untouchable. We try to do other things around that. And as we have noted, two of what we find to be the most powerful traditions, a sort of rethought self-fashioning mode, and now here and moving into next week too, a rethought ethics of connection. Note in both of these, but I'll here focus mainly on the Confucian side of it, that is explicitly rejected. So to return to the world, if humans are just messes of energies that fall into patterns, most of them bad and dangerous, and we're training ourselves to work on those, what if the entire cosmos is this way? In other words, the entire cosmos does not consist of an unchanging structure with natural laws, it's patterns of interaction. And since we are messes too in this mess of stuff, everything we do will also affect it. So as I mentioned, when we define the world, these patterns of interaction above us as having seasons, when we defined our interaction with that world, as well as accordingly, stuff that grew out of the ground accordingly, and when we began the work of trying to domesticate that world and the stuff that grows out, the result was the creation of agriculture, which completely transformed that world, transforming those patterns of interaction into a world that would be productive for us. So we killed the wild animals, we burned down the forests, we domesticate the animals that will work for us, we domesticate grains, we alter all of those patterns into ways that will be productive for us as humans. Now, obviously, work continues as we much later find fossil fuels, etc., as we are now coming to see the dangers of the worlds that we have created. We, from this point of view, need to realize we have created those patterns. We did them for our benefit with implications we never thought through, because that's how patterns work. You set into patterns and they take on life of their own. And if we're going to rethink the world as patterns, it means we need to rethink our interaction not just with ourselves, but with the entire cosmic world, because from this point of view, that world that we experience is largely a product of our domestication, and in the States we are now seeing the incredible dangers of the ways we've domesticated it, and that too needs to be rethought. So in short, part of the power of this tradition is it is going to say, what happens if we are going to redefine everything, the self, human interaction, the entire cosmos as patterns of interaction. What would that mean if we accept as a given that most of these patterns of interaction are not going to be good things? If we even accept that even decisions to whether they're good things, it's not going to be pre-given to us. There's no deity that will tell us. We are going to have to work on that, which means we will almost assuredly make horrible decisions if we're even making decisions. Even when we get to the point of deciding, we probably will make bad ones, which means you're doing a constant work of rethinking patterns to try to create worlds where things are actually interacting, flourishing, and built into this is the idea you will never have a final moment of doing it successfully, because by definition, everything will fall into patterns, and some of them may be productive at certain moments for certain things, but almost assuredly will be dangerous in other ways that we oftentimes fail to see. So it's an entire ethics and political vision, and therefore philosophy and religion, based upon endlessly seeing the world as patterns and endlessly trying to create a world of real interaction. And since that is always due, it means it is a never-ending process in our lives and in generation after generation. It is, in short, an incredibly powerful tradition that is not always, has not always, I should put it politely, been appropriated in the most powerful ways. And our hopes, pushing more toward next week, is to ask, how would we take this tradition and rethink it for the current world? So should we open up for me, or
So Michael,
please?
so I have been intending to take quite a different approach
Yes.
to the ethic of connection. emphasizing less Confucianism than what we can make out of this tradition
Yes.
now, as you said.
Yes.
But I think I should postpone that to next week, and we should have a conversation about what you just said.
Sure.
But I'd like to begin that conversation by asking you a question.
Yes.
So, your discourse focused on the idea of breaking patterns,
Yeah, or altering and shifting. Yes.
altering and shifting the patterns.
Yes.
And to a Westerner, that idea naturally suggests a conception of emancipation. That is, the patterns are restraints, we break the patterns. What's the reward of the breaking of the patterns?
Precisely.
The reward of the breaking of the patterns is that the self frees itself from these dogmas and formulas, these chains,
Exactly.
and is able to do something.
Yes.
But you clearly did not intend that.
Definitely
So
not, yeah.
then later in your discourse, you shifted to the focus on meritocracy,
Yes.
which is the creation of a service elite working in the state, and you emphasize the qualities of judgment and of character that would be called for in such a service elite. So you might have been speaking, for example, about the program of the Kennedy School as this agenda for the service elite. But we know that meritocracy is not just contestable, controversial, as you noted, but underdetermining. If there's a meritocracy, it doesn't tell you how is society going to be organized. Will it be a class society? Will it be something else?
Absolutely.
Or it tells you nothing about the actual conduct of life.
Precisely.
So I'm perplexed about what the message is, because at the end you said you used a vocabulary suggesting something about the reward for this breaking of patterns. When you said that the breaking of patterns would allow for real interactions, you call them at one point real, at another point you call them serious.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
I want to open this black box of what
Yes.
serious or real interactions
Yes.
mean
Yes.
by contrast to interactions that are not real or not
Yes.
serious.
Yes.
Because once again, to a Westerner, this has like an existential connotation.
Yes.
The authentic as opposed to the false, and so
Precisely.
which I assume you didn't.
Right.
So what is the payoff? What is the
Yes.
reward which this exercise points to, other than the creation of a technocratic service elite to the state?
Yes. Yeah, excellent question. And actually, I'll even follow the arc of the question, beginning with the issue of patterns, then the whole issue of meritocracy,
Yeah.
and closing with this. So, to begin with the first part, absolutely. So, indeed, we in America, when we hear these words about patterns and altering them, as you said, immediately we will think in terms of the vision of sort of non-conformity that we've been discussing, either in its most powerful way or in the more domesticated American form, which would basically be, oh yes, we fall into patterns and we need to have the liberated self breaking out of patterns. And as we have noted, no, in Confucius, that would be seen as not only wrong, but even dangerous, right? The radical individual is going to be a set of patterns, and if I, as the radical individual, am going to be breaking from the world, I'm probably playing into some of my worst patterns, and there's always the question of Confucianism that we've touched on as well. Then what happens, right? Like somehow you have to reconnect with people, and how? So absolutely. So the concern is it's a world of patterns. It will always be, right? Energies are always interacting, and then what you're trying to do is shift a world in which these patterns are defining everything by rote. So going back to the example of I getting angry because someone walks in to pull out socks from a drawer, that I'll then later say, no, I just have a bad temper. No, I fall into a pattern of interaction that has nothing to do with what's actually happening. Like I'm not even responding to the world. I'm just acting by rote pattern. And the argument is, if this is what we are like as humans, and build this into entire social interactions, then what you're trying to do is not emancipate yourself as an individual breaking out of these patterns. what you're trying to do is to shift these patterns, alter these patterns, and yeah, the Chinese terms for things I was translating is sort of real and true. The terms are actual interactions, meaning that you are growing to see those around you as what they really are, which is messy. So to give you a standard example, if I see this person and think, okay, that's a mean person and this other person's a nice person, no. Or rather, that may be a completely accurate description right now, but that's because I have fallen into a pattern of interaction where I bring out that person's mean sides toward me. Whatever I'm doing somehow plays into that pattern, so that person has patterns as I do. This other person may be nice, but that's not because they are nice, it's because I have a pattern of interaction with them, which means the latter is nicer to me than the former, but they're both patterns of interaction, and I'm not really interacting with them. I'm interacting by pattern. And when you're really interacting with them, you're interacting with them as messes, which means malleable, which means there are other sides to ourselves and those around us, not in a divine sense, but other sides in the sense literally, they've got messes of different energies. And this is equally true of the patterns in the social world. If the world really is messy, and we don't perceive it as such because we're living in a world where these patterns are hardened, then what you're trying to do is to alter them. Now, this moves us immediately into the meritocracy question. So, again, when we use the term meritocracy, it's a very limited definition, and a quick, very brief history of this is going to be telling. So, when in the West you first start getting a vision that this great chain of being idea that we've mentioned, that we're born into a social world that we should stay in because it's God-given, when this begins to break down is in 17th, 18th century political theory, and I might add a key component of that actually is intriguingly China. So Voltaire is reading Jesuit accounts. The Jesuits start going to China in the 16th century. They start writing accounts of China. In these accounts, they say, oh my gosh, there's this world over there across Eurasia where the government is actually led by an educated elite, not by an hereditary elite. In Europe, of course, it's entirely defined by an aristocracy that controls all land, all resources, all positions of power are defined by birth. And so people like Voltaire saying, well, no, we could create a world of an educated elite because it exists in China. And you can actually trace how these ideas start later becoming institutionalized, but it's in telling ways in the 19th century. When these ideas start getting institutionalized, it's sadly in things that we are living in as later versions of. So the visions that start coming in for so-called meritocracy, which is incredibly limited, are based upon a radically different vision of the self and the merit. So, to give you an obvious example, well, I'll jump up to modern times, but you can see the early versions of this in the 19th century, but to move it to our lives. So, we all take now, sadly for us, standardized tests. I think we can all agree these standardized tests do not do the work they claim to be doing. We all know perfectly well we're not going to be measuring our intelligence. It's all about just training yourself to take them well, and I think we can all agree, having sadly had to do that, we learned nothing. We did not train ourselves in any helpful way to train ourselves to take the SAT. And this is all for some telling reasons. So when the SAT was invented, it was invented to test your intelligence. It's trying to see, it's very much assuming a world where some people are, they wouldn't use the word God-given because it's the secular version of that, but some people are inherently more intelligent than others, and the SAT was designed to find the inherently intelligent people and bring them into positions of power by first bringing them into top-tier universities. Now, the SAT finally dropped that language, but it still largely follows it, and that is the vision of the SAT. Same with personality tests that try to find who we are as a person and what careers we're good for. It assumes you already have a certain set of things you're gifted at, a certain level of intelligence, you're better at engineering or you're better at this other thing. The goal of standardized tests is to find out where you are in the hierarchy of intelligence and in terms of where your skill set is, and to put you in places where you can be successful. If you're really good, you go to a better college than someone who seems not very intelligent. In either way, a college that would be playing to what is best for you based on who you are. Now, I say all of this to say we are living in a world that claims to be meritocratic, and I think we all sadly know it is hardly succeeding in that. And this comes down to even the very ways that these tests operate. I say all of this to return to your question. So even the piece of Confucianism, as I noted, not all Confucians are in favor of the imperial bureaucracy, a lot actively refused to take part in it, but even those who were part of it, they would have opposed every single thing I mentioned. The opening move of Confucianism is, if everyone is a mess, you are not trying to find out what people are gifted at, who's more intelligent. And Xunzi has these amazing statements where he'll say, even if you think you're gifted at something, it's very dangerous because it means you'll stop training yourself and you'll cease to be good at it. Or the other way, if you think you are actually not terribly good at something, that's actually much better because then you have to work at it, and then very soon you'll actually end up being really good at it. So we'll say, therefore, stop even thinking in these terms. Think of yourself as a mess and think of everything as training. And the entire way the civil service exam was written, as you've noted, for all of its problems, I mean, it's obviously a perfect system, but for all of its problems, note, it's not trying to see, are you naturally good at something, are you inherently good at something? It's all about the training. Now, all of this is actually to get to the final part of your question. So, in a sense, I think this is part of what's intriguing about the tradition is it won't give you an answer to that question. So the idea is
to which question?
To ultimately, where will this take us? The ultimate vision would be, on the contrary, what you're trying to do is anything you can to inspire people to do this work of self-cultivation. And if you can do it, the idea is you're training yourself to see the world as patterns and training yourself to work with them. And there's no sense that you will ever come up with a final solution to this.
No, but forget about definitive solutions. But the main brunt of my provocation to you was that this contrast between pattern and unpatterned seems perpendicular to the two central issues that we take up. So one is, how should I live my life? The conduct of life. What should I do with my life? It has no clear message. It signals a form of empowerment that will be able to allow you to address that question more effectively. But it doesn't provide a message about how to live my life. And the second question of these twin questions is, how should society be organized?
Exactly.
Because the existence of a technocratic service elite is only a tiny, indeterminate fragment of an answer to the question, how should society be organized?
Oh, of course.
So that's what I didn't understand.
Supporting bureaucracy. But no, but the reason.
So do you not think that Confucianism has an answer to the question of the conduct of life?
No, I think they do, but not in the way you're asking. And I want to put this in a good way. So I think the answer is yes, but not in the sense that it will say, well, I'll give the opposite example. It is not going to say the ultimate goal is for you to fashion a self that will be unique and great for the
No, it doesn't have to use that language of the isolated self. But it has to have, but does it not have, or should it not have a message about the conduct of life? Even apart from any conception of the isolated self.
Oh, but then what would you say is the message of self-action?
The message of self-fashioning is the one that we examine, that it's this idea of autonomy, which we have to supplement because it's empty, and so we have to have another idea of autonomy.
Exactly.
So we have to distinguish the uncorrected message from the corrected message. That was and will that not be true of this also?
Oh, well, the corrected part, but the autonomy, definitely not. So,
No, it doesn't take that form.
Yes.
Yes.
So yes, but no, the argument would be precisely this. So it is not going to say your goal is autonomy. Your goal is training yourself to interact in ways that will allow for the possibility of flourishing of you and, well, in the immediate Confucian sense, those around you and pushing, including figures like Zhuangzi, everything around you. It is all about interaction and flourishing of everything through interaction. It is not about rising autonomy.
So, for example,
dealing with how to become
Confucius
autonomous.
Confucius sets great store by the the ideal of reciprocity.
Yes,
The norm of
absolutely.
reciprocity. He formulates the golden rule in the negative form rather than the positive
Yes.
form. Do not impose on others what you would not like imposed on you. But this norm of reciprocity is
Yes.
incomplete, indeterminate. It has to be translated both into a way of organizing society and into a way of living. So, is there not here a vision of what it would mean to live according to the norm of reciprocity in interactions with other people?
Oh, the answer is absolutely yes, but again, I mean, not in the ways we usually use that word. So I'll refer back to some of the very terms I mentioned in passing when Confucius is called joyous. So let me say a few more words about that. So the term joy is the same as music in classical Chinese, and the same character. And the reason this is relevant is think of joy not as my personal happiness. Think of joy, and this is the portrait of Henry Alex. Joy is resonance, right? Think of music as when notes that we can call singular, our mistake, if we define the world as consisting of singular types of notes, what is going on in resonance is the notes are being connected and brought together. So an example I'll often use, if you pluck a lute on this side of the room, it will vibrate another lute on this side of the room because there's an intrinsic resonance. That resonance is usually lost in our patterns of interaction. And if you gain it, and the sense is Confucius is finally gaining this, he's become this person who is deeply caring in this resonant sense, right? Joy is in the sense that he connects with people, he does things that allow others to connect with each other at a socio-political level. He can see the patterns that prevent that, and he's able to do things that open up those connections. Now, let me immediately move to the second part of your question, which is crucial. If you ask, as we properly do, in the vision of self-passioning, what would be its political implications? And we've noticed, for all the dangers of it, it's going to entail some kind of visions of democracy, either radicalized or domesticated, etc. Intriguingly, in Confucianism, there's no equivalent of that. Now, there are these pushes. There are the pushes toward emphasizing education, cultivation, to create interaction, but there's no push around an ism. I mean, even, again, I want to emphasize strongly, the whole part of imperial bureaucracy, a lot of Confucians refuse to be members of that. So even that should not be seen as the final culmination of a Confucian vision, not at all. The push of the Confucian tradition is rather, and I'll refer to the speaker Shun that I mentioned in passing, his way of phrasing it, you're training yourself to begin seeing the world around you. So we're born into a world where patterns have been developing for centuries and millennia. You're training yourself to not think of it in terms of certain ideological modes. You're training yourself to see it in terms of patterns of interaction and begin seeing the dangers. So, what this would mean right now, let's begin with America as the obvious place. Right now, drop the words capitalism, democracy, etc., and ask, what are the patterns of interaction that are playing out? What are the powers of those, the places where things seem to be working in certain areas to actually generate real interaction? And what are the places where oftentimes those exact same practices are failing? And how would you concretely begin reworking it? And the reason Shun's will put it that way is if you begin saying, what is the ideal society, you're going to fall into dangerous sets of patterns. It's rather, what are the patterns and how do you begin operating them, shifting them, altering them? And does this answer your question? I would say it does. Now, part of the power, though, is it's not going to give you content to that.
Doesn't there have to be a direction?
Oh, yeah, there will always
Both
be
with
direction.
respect to the
Yes,
conduct of
definitely.
life and with respect
There's
to the
absolutely-
organization of
yes,
society?
Definitely. So there's absolutely a direction. The direction is always toward education, cultivation aimed at actual interaction, actual, real, and these are all the translations of the Chinese terms that mean you're not simply interacting by rote pattern. Yes. But the focus is interaction. It's not autonomy. Yes.
Why don't we open up to the
Indeed.
class?
Yes, please.
How do we distinguish between interactions that are due to habit and just rote patterns and the ones that are genuine?
Yes. Great question. And the answer is if it's a pattern that simply repeats, either regardless of who the people involved are, or it's the same people simply repeating it regardless of the situation, that is always seen as a dangerous pattern. Now, you could correctly say, but couldn't you imagine situations, even with those two examples, where it could play out well? And the answer is yes, but if it's a rote pattern, you won't see it as such, which means even if in a certain situation, you know, it works out fine. So my dad yells at me, great. Like in a certain situation, I'm sure I deserve it. But if it's playing out a pattern where that's, I have a wonderful father, so he's ever listening. This is not about us, Dad. But if that's playing out in other ways, then it's a rote pattern that is not actually able to shift with the complex, messy people involved and the complex, messy situations involved. And so all interactions ideally should be interactions in which you are dealing with the messy world as a messy world, a messy, malleable world, which means it's ever changeable. You see it's ever changeable, and you're responsive to that ever changing world. And so terms that are very important in the Confucian tradition are things like responsiveness, care, vulnerability, which is going to be an important term because the idea is it's very easy when you're falling into, getting back to the heart of your question, if you're falling into rote patterns, you're not vulnerable because you just interact with people the same way, regardless of who you're interacting with, regardless of the situation. If, on the contrary, you're responsive, you'll often fail because you'll say the situation's wrong, but then you're hopefully constantly learning from it. So vulnerability, responsiveness, and this is why, going back to your question, music is such an overwhelmingly important analogy in the tradition. The idea is, this is what music is. Music is ever, if you think, not us, music we create, but the music of the cosmos, it's ever changing, and what it really is a resonance of everything. And that's what you're aiming for. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
I got the sense like it's about sort of being flexible or limber.
Yes, yes.
Sort of in society.
Yes.
You touched on this earlier, but maybe you could flesh it out a little. Can a rote pattern ever be conducive to harmony, and what is the danger of that, if there is a danger?
Yeah, the answer is yes for brief periods of time, but that's why it's dangerous, because only for brief periods of time. So if it's simply a rote pattern that we're simply repeating regardless of the people involved, or with the same people, but regardless of the situation, again, there may be certain situations where that works out wonderfully. Inevitably, there will be other situations, because it's a messy world, where we will not be remotely able to respond to the situation, because we won't be responsive. We'll just be repeating the same pattern, and inevitably, it will lead us to act horribly. And so the sense is you are always training yourself, and this is one of the places where it's most difficult, even when things seem to be going well, you're training yourself to constantly be looking for patterns and constantly be training yourself to be more responsive. And again, it's more dangerous when things are going well for us.
Looking for patterns with an eye to breaking them.
Well, yeah, altering them. Again, not breaking the sense of the autonomous self, though.
So if you take the musical analogy,
Yes.
music depends on an interplay between consonance and
Precisely.
dissonance.
Precisely.
And it's crucial to every style of music
Precisely.
what the principle of consonance is. There's no music without consonance. And so,
Well, but
and so
consonance-
what is
Think
heard,
of-
what
think
is
of
heard,
jazz.
what is heard as dissonance in one historical period is heard as
Definitely.
consonance in the next.
Precisely.
So it's clearly mutable. But
definitely,
but
absolutely.
it's just that this contrast between consonance and dissonance does not seem sufficient to resolve the problem of the content or the direction of either the moral or the political.
Oh, but think of, to stick with your analogy, think of jazz. Like, when jazz is done well, it means you have players who are so responsive to what others are doing that they're constantly building upon the other, but even that word kind of misses it, constantly sort of sensing the other. And we can re-describe that as
And can they not all be going in the wrong direction?
Definitely, absolutely. But that's what they're hopefully training themselves to sense. So if you're perfectly responding together in jazz performance, and if one of them can begin to sense this is going in a really horrible direction, again, you don't stop it and say, okay, let's start again. You begin sensing, okay, why? Is this person getting a little upset? Is this person a little resentful about something else? And how do I shift the tone, shift the notes to begin to kind of bring them back in and alter the trajectory of this? And so it's all about sensing trajectories and working with them. And when you do it well, it's stunning. You often, but this is also part of the power of it, it's not done well, but of course the jazz players, of course they don't always do it successfully, but then they learn from it. And that's what a human life is, right? We're constantly trying to sense each other and often making horrible, horrible decisions. But again, they would say, even though we're decisions, it's a very unconfusion way of putting it. Most of what we do are not decisions or choices, we just play out things. And usually not in a responsive way. We're training ourselves to be responsive. Yes, and then getting back to the content issue, you're absolutely right, that's not a content answer, but to me that's part of the power. It's saying, if it is a world of endless energies, what you're training yourself to do is to interact with them, and out of that interaction comes the equivalent of music. Yes. Yes, please.
I wanted to maybe circle back to the like human nature interaction.
Yes.
So I guess in contrast to the other traditions where there was something very unique about being human, like a sense of agency or creativity, here I'm sort of wondering, thinking about like two rocks interacting, they never mess up. They're always sort of like in harmony with each other in a sense. And whereas humans sort of seem to have like a unique capacity to sort of form these sort of rodent behaviors. So I'm wondering if that's like sort of like where the sort of unique like humanness comes in here.
Yeah, great question. And to answer this, let me introduce you to a few Chinese terms, that at least one of which is made into the English lexicon, so hopefully this won't be too confusing, but it will get to the heart of what you're asking. So I keep using the term energies and saying it's a world of energies. But just as when we define the world as consisting, for example, of seasons, and again, that's our term, that's our way of mapping these interactions, there are other mappings that we can give that will answer your question. So how do we understand the kinds of interactions we as humans fall into that, as you said, seem to be a lot more problematic than rocks? And what are the ways of mapping that would be, again, not right, but a way of mapping it that would help us to cultivate ourselves to do it better? So here's the way they'll do it. So the term I've been using as energies, the Chinese term, it's begun to make it into the English lexicon, is qi, Q-I, or the older romanization is C-H'-I. If you've seen that one, it's the same word, qi, which means energy, but there's no distinction of matter and energy. So everything is qi. It means a rock is qi and air is qi. Needless to say, these are very different types of qi. So when we map them, we can map them as being, there are some types of qi, like mud is an even more extreme example. Mud is called turbid, right? It's very turbid qi, it's very unresponsive qi. I can walk on mud and I move it, but it doesn't really respond, apart from being moved. So it's very turbid, unresponsive qi. If there are spirits above, we'll call them spirits. And spirits, for those of you who know Chinese, Shan is the term I'm using here, those spirits would be, on the contrary, flawlessly resonant qi. So there are paintings of them, they're literally dancing on the clouds, dancing together, dancing through the clouds. The idea is they're flawlessly resonant. They see clearly, they hear clearly, they see all the patterns playing out below them on Earth. They can alter things, but they don't have to physically pick up things. They can alter things just by the movements of qi because they're so resonant. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is to get back to the heart of your question. So think of humans. I keep saying we're a mess, but here's to define what I mean by that. We're a mess of these different types of chi. So that word, Chun, spirit, we have a little bit of that in us. A little bit. It is why we are conscious. It is why we are able to be somewhat interactive in the world, much more than mud. It's why I can move things, but I have to use my hand. So we have a little bit of spirit within us, a little bit of Chun. We also have a lot of really turbid chi within us. And the view is usually the way we live our lives as humans are that spirit literally seeps out. So we lose our highly resonant, responsive chi. We become less conscious, less vital in the world, less healthy, less alive, less vibrant, less energetic, less able to work with the world, less like them, the spirits above, and we're becoming more like mud. And what that means is we become more like mud is we cease to be really responsive to the world. We're the equivalent of the mud. When I walk on the mud, I push the mud, I affect it, but the mud doesn't really respond. We, over time, become more like mud. Now, what happens if we cultivate ourselves in the ways they're talking about? The view is, again, this is all energy, so we, in a very literal sense they mean, we become more like the spirits above. By which I mean, literally, we get more highly spiritual chi. We get more spirit. So we become more conscious, more alive, more, but again, this is the key difference of this versus an autonomy vision, more responsive to the world, more resonant to the world, more like the spirits above. Now, then we still have the turbid chi here too, but what you're doing in cultivation is you're becoming more resonant, which means, getting back to your question, yes, our dangerous patterns means we're being more like mud. And were we to become this kind of joyous, humane figure, we are literally becoming more like the spirits above, literally because we're literally getting more of the same stuff that they have, which is the same stuff as mud, but just highly resonant and highly responsive. And this also touches on Roberto's earlier question too. What would this mean? We can't say in advance. But if more and more of us become more and more resonant and responsive, we are more able to see patterns around us, more able to work with those patterns, and more able to generate real interactions amongst everything. We become, socially in other words, more like them as well. So yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
Oh, hi. So I wondered if you could talk about the domestication of Confucianism.
Yes.
Yes, because like in Korea, like
Yes.
Confucianist culture, it's like more of a way to entrench social
Definitely.
hierarchy, like not very progressive.
Definitely.
Yes.
Yes, so thank you. So indeed, so we've mentioned the different ways these ideas in Christianity, Buddhism have become domesticated. So yes, let me indeed speak to the ways they've become domesticated in the past few centuries, and very much including today. So let me go back. I said a few centuries. Let me actually go back a little bit further. I was mentioning before the 12th century, when you're getting these meritocratic bureaucracies, you get something else in the 12th century that is going to play out in exactly the way you've mentioned. So this is the emergence of what has come to be called Neo-Confucianism. It emerges again in the 12th century. The main figure is, it's actually a number of figures, but by far the most important is a figure called Jushi. And Jushi's argument is that everything we've been discussing is fine and good, Jushi will say, but, he argues, let's be honest. The truth is, there are those few people, he clearly thought he was amongst them, who will truly do all that we have mentioned, become truly humane, and the term that he will use is a sage. A sage is someone who's so extraordinary, he's like these spirits above, just beyond just humane, which is something we all might be able to achieve. It's just a stunning, stunning, rare person who's flawless at this. Jushi thought, clearly, he was one. He thought, looking back, Confucius was one. He thought Mencius was one. And he thought the way, as he called it, had been lost after Mencius. So no sages ever since, which means everything that happened since then should be rejected. And what happened since then? I'll give an example that will be telling for his position. They started, the Confucians, started actually designing rituals to do the things that Confucius was talking about, but how do you actually do it? For example, they began designing rituals that involved role reversals, that involved every individual, if you can get involved. We just mentioned the one for monarchs, but the idea was everyone should be doing these, variations of these, and Jushi said, this is ridiculous. I can do those because I'm a sage, or rather I can do them to help myself become a sage, but most people will never really do them because simply doing a role reversal doesn't work. You actually have to start doing it fully. And so Jushi writes something called the family rituals, and it's been translated, by the way. You can look at it. It's, well, I would say horrifying from my own philosophical viewpoint. So what he does is he writes a series of rituals that should be performed within the family, and he is explicit in the preface. He is doing this for every family other than those who really could generate sages, like his own presumably. And in these, there are no role reversals. He says that's part of the loss of the way, because there was this foolish belief that people in general could do this. And what you do in these, and sadly this is what you've experienced, is you do rituals that are literally about socializing you to play the role in the family. So you do the ritual not to do a role reversal, you do a ritual to train you to be a good father, to train you to be a good wife, to train you to be a good son. And in a very hierarchical, patriarchal vision, Jushi says, this is what everyone needs because it'll maintain order. Then for the few people who become educated, they'll move beyond this, and then all the stuff that Confucius and Mencius are talking about comes into play. But for the vast majority of families, this is what you should do. Surprise, surprise, the states in China, Japan, Korea, and what's now northern Vietnam love this idea. And literally this work called the family rituals is sent to let me say several centuries, but to every family. So by the Ming Dynasty, so 4 centuries later, literally every family was given either the manual, or for illiterate families, there are actually people who come in and train them to do these. And you are literally being trained to be socialized into social roles. Now, all that we've been discussing is still there in Neo-Confucianism, but it's there for this tiny, tiny elite. And I might add, Jushi didn't say that elite would necessarily be imperial bureaucracy. He's one of the people who actually refused to be part of the imperial bureaucracy, but he did think it was this narrow, self-cultivated elite. And to continue what I would say is the sad story, right now, when Xi Jinping is calling himself a Confucian, you can probably guess what side of Confucianism he's pulling from. So he's pulling from that state-based form of orthodox Neo-Confucianism that had become dominant in the states of China, Japan, Korea, and northern Vietnam. That's what he is pushing. And so, needless to say, I would argue strongly that is not the side that I think we should really be pushing and developing. That's literally the equivalent of following the great chain of being, following the vision of Christianity. I think the key for us is to go to the most exciting elements, which is, in this case, the pre-Jushi vision of rituals, the ones that he literally says represent a loss of the way because it foolishly thinks everyone should be doing this. But yeah, great question. It is a form of domestication that has literally defined the tradition for centuries, and right now is being actively propagated in China. Yes, thank you. Yes, please. Yes, we have very briefly.
We can do next.
Oh no, we're very quick on. Yes.
To return to Professor Unger's critique, there's a sense, because of the resonance of music, there's a sense in which the grounds on which any single individual, people make the simplistic Confucianism defaults to the community and liberalism defaults to the individual.
Yes.
Do you think by its setup itself, because resonance is required, that there is there to what Professor Unger is saying? Or do you think that at the end of the day that can be overcome in a kind of reconciliation? I think that's what we're moving to, right?
Yeah, no, we are, and we will indeed return to this next week. But let me just say a couple of words as a preface. So the answer is, in part yes and in part no. I know you probably hate it when academics say that, so sorry. but the reason I do so is I do think, and we will see in the next few weeks, that in their revised form, these two main traditions we'll be focusing on, the tradition of self-fashioning and the tradition of connection, do come together in many ways politically, because they're both pushing in very surprisingly counterintuitive ways, but I think we'll see they start pushing into very similar places. That being said, I do think we will see a significant difference. I mean, I think if you're coming out of the Confucian tradition, a vision of the radical individual autonomy, it's difficult to imagine that position ever being seen as something other than something that's potentially powerful, but only temporarily so, because it's always going to be seen as a potentially dangerous vision. And so I do think we will continue to see a powerful tension. Now, that being said, tensions are not bad things. I think tensions can be incredibly productive. So part of what we'll be doing over the next several weeks is asking how, if that's the case, how could there be a productive tension between these where we're not going to try to reduce one to the other, but where each could hopefully offer a powerful and productive challenge to the other, where ideally neither would win, and yet ideally that productive tension would be mutually growing for each, taking them into directions that we couldn't imagine, but possibly, getting back to your question, not to a final synthesis. Maybe that isn't even what we would hope to gain. From the Confucian perspective, the view would be, well, no, interactions are not pure oneness. On the contrary, interactions assume a world of endless differences and endless interactions, and that can actually be a very powerful and productive thing. So that's a quick answer, but yes.
The contrast begins with a different starting point.
Yes, exactly.
So the starting
Precisely.
point of the ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity is the isolated ego,
Precisely.
which overcomes its isolation in some way,
Precisely.
but that's what it starts with. The
Yes.
starting point of the ethic of connection is the intersubjective, joint intentionality.
Yeah,
At the very
interaction.
beginning, it's you and me,
Exactly. Always.
and the construction of a world based on the interpersonal. The
Yes.
interpersonal is the ultimate source of reality and of authority. It is what is sacred. And if there's anything transcendent in the world, the transcendent is that, the moral logic of the interpersonal.
Yeah, or even interaction beyond even just the interpersonal,
Yeah.
interaction writ large. I agree. It's because of those radically different opening points, they are not ever going to, like, ideally, would not ever make a pure synthesis of ultimately productive tension. Yes. Which is a perfect projection going forward. So this will literally be the topic we will be looking at. First, next week, as we ask, how would we revise this ethic of connection for the contemporary period? And then those next 2 weeks will turn directly to this question of how would we bring these together, not in the form of a synthesis, but in the form of a productive tension.